Ladies and gentlemen, they laughed. High above the European skies, German pilots, flying their sleek, nimble Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, looked down at a new American fighter and scoffed. It was big, it was heavy. It looked more like a flying milk jug than a dogfighter. That plane was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. But soon enough those same pilots would stop laughing, because when the Thunderbolt opened fire, it didn't just bark, it roared. Habodi Part 1 the underdog. When the P-47 first rolled out in 1941, it seemed almost absurd. Weighing in at nearly 8 tons when fully loaded, it was one of the largest single-engine fighters of the war. The German Luftwaffe, proud of their sleek B-109s and few 190s, thought it would be an easy kill. After all, how could a fat jug outmaneuver their agile aircraft? But the P-47 wasn't built to dance. It was built to end fights. Body Part 2 when the beast unleashed. Beneath its massive frame lay a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, over 2,000 horsepower of pure thunder. At full throttle, the P-47 could climb, dive, and scream across the sky faster than most expected. And when it dove, that heavy weight became an advantage. It dropped like a hammer of steel, chasing enemies who thought they could escape. Then came its true calling card, 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, each one capable of spitting hundreds of rounds per minute. Together, they unleashed a wall of lead so dense that German pilots said it looked like a shimmering river of fire. One burst from a Thunderbolt could shred a fighter or tear a train apart. Soon, laughter turned to fear every time a jug appeared in the sky. Body Part 3, the hero in the shadows. But the P-47 wasn't just a fighter, it was a protector. It escorted bombers deep into enemy territory, absorbing flak and fire to keep crews alive. It strafed convoys, shattered tanks, and broke supply lines that fed the Nazi war machine. Thunderbolt pilots like Francis Gaby, Gabreski, and Robert S. Johnson became legends, aces whose courage and firepower shaped the skies over Europe. And when the war shifted, the P-47 adapted, becoming a ruthless ground attack aircraft. Its heavy armor could take hits that would send other planes spiraling down. It earned a new title, the jug that couldn't be killed. Habodi Part 3D, the hero in the shadows. But the P-47 wasn't just a fighter, it was a protector. It escorted bombers deep into enemy territory, absorbing flak and fire to keep crews alive. It strafed convoys, shattered tanks, and broke supply lines that fed the Nazi war machine. Thunderbolt pilots like Francis Gaby, Gabreski, and Robert S. Johnson became legends, aces whose courage and firepower shaped the skies over Europe. And when the war shifted, the P-47 adapted, becoming a ruthless ground attack aircraft. Its heavy armor could take hits that would send other planes spiraling down. It earned a new title, the jug that couldn't be killed. Closing line. So remember this story of the Thunderbolt, the jug, because in every field of battle, whether in the skies of Europe or the challenges we face today, never underestimate the underdog. Sometimes the ones who get laughed at are the ones who change the world. When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first appeared on airfields in 1941, even the men who were supposed to fly it hesitated. It didn't look like a fighter, it looked like something that belonged in a barn. With its wide, barrel-shaped fuselage, thick wings, and enormous propeller, it seemed more like a metal jug than a machine built for the knife-edge world of aerial combat. Pilots used to the sleek lines of the Spitfire or the sharp, predatory silhouette of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 could hardly believe that this massive brute was meant to meet them in the sky. The German flyers, known for their pride and discipline, laughed openly when they first encountered it. To them, it was an insult to the very concept of a fighter aircraft. How could something so large, so ungainly, possibly stand a chance in a turning dogfight against their swift and nimble machines? Their laughter, of course, was understandable. The Luftwaffe had begun the war with the best pilots in the world and some of the finest aircraft ever designed. The Messerschmitt and the Focke-Wulf were fast, light, and agile, refined instruments honed for deadly precision. The P-47, on the other hand, looked like a farm tool. It was nearly twice the weight of most German fighters and far larger in profile. From a distance it lacked grace, up close it looked industrial, almost clumsy. To a German ace used to slipping behind an enemy fighter in a smooth, looping turn and finishing the job with a short, clean burst of cannon fire, the thought of facing a Thunderbolt seemed laughable. They joked that they would need only a few seconds to send such a flying barrel spiraling down in flames. But the Americans who built the P-47 had different priorities. They weren't trying to design the most elegant machine in the air. They were designing one that could win a war. The Republic Aviation engineers knew that air combat over Europe wasn't going to be about graceful turns. It would be about range, power, and survival. The Thunderbolt's massive frame wasn't a flaw, it was armor. It was protection for its pilot, protection for its engine, and a platform sturdy enough to carry firepower that no other single-engine fighter could match. While German pilots mocked its looks, the Americans quietly prepared to unleash one of the most formidable machines of the Second World War. When the P-47 finally took to the skies in combat, its size proved deceptive. At over 8 tons when fully loaded, it was indeed heavy, but that weight came with stability. The heart of the machine, a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, produced more than 2,000 horsepower. This powerhouse could push the jug, as pilots affectionately nicknamed it, to speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour. In a dive, the Thunderbolt became an unstoppable missile. German pilots who tried to shake it off found that the P-47 could plunge faster and longer than any fighter they had. The same weight they had laughed at now became its greatest weapon. Those first dogfights over occupied Europe quickly silenced the laughter. German flyers, confident as ever, dove onto bomber formations escorted by the Thunderbolts. They expected the usual: a few passes, a few kills, and an easy retreat. But when they pulled their triggers and saw rounds bounce off the Jug's thick armor plating, the reality began to sink in. The Thunderbolt wasn't just big, it was nearly indestructible. It could take hits that would tear a Messerschmitt apart and still keep flying. Some pilots came home with gaping holes in their wings, missing cylinders, and hundreds of bullet punctures, yet their P-47s brought them safely back across the channel. Word spread through the Luftwaffe ranks the flying milk jug was no joke. It came to sound those 8 Browning, 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, all firing at once. The air around a Thunderbolt erupted into thunder and flame, a solid wall of lead that could rip through steel, concrete, and flesh alike. German pilots who once laughed about the plane's bulk now found themselves flying through curtains of tracers. In seconds, an enemy fighter could vanish in a burst of sparks and smoke. Those who survived the first encounters carried stories of horror and disbelief. The American plane that seemed too big to fight was cutting through their squadrons like a saw through wood. Behind those terrifying guns sat men who had grown to love the aircraft their enemies had mocked. American pilots came to understand what the engineers had intended all along. The P-47 might not turn as tightly as a Spitfire or climb as quickly as a Messerschmitt, but it could dive faster than anything in the sky, strike harder, and take more punishment. Its cockpit was a fortress, its systems redundant, and its engine so tough it could keep running even after losing cylinders. In the cockpit, a pilot felt safe, confident, almost invincible. They joked that the plane was so sturdy it could probably plow through a brick wall and keep flying. That confidence turned into aggression, and aggression turned into victory. In the months that followed, the Thunderbolt became the scourge of German airspace. The same pilots who had laughed now dreaded the sight of its blunt nose and spinning propeller. They learned that chasing it in a dive was suicide. The P-47 would simply accelerate beyond their reach. Attacking it head-on was worse. Its 8 guns would meet them before they could even get close. Even the Luftwaffe's best, the battle-hardened veterans of Spain and the Blitz, began to respect the Jug. And respect, on the battlefield, is the first sign of fear. The transformation from ridicule to reverence was swift. German intelligence reports began describing the P-47 as a heavy fighter of exceptional performance. Pilots were warned not to underestimate it. By 1944, Luftwaffe commanders understood that the American plane they had once mocked was now dominating both the skies and the ground below. It escorted bombers deep into Germany, tore apart armored columns with bombs and rockets, and left smoking craters where supply trains once ran. The laughter that had echoed in German hangars 3 years earlier was replaced by silence, then by grim determination to survive another mission. The irony of the Thunderbolt story is that the very qualities that invited mockery, its size, its weight, its ruggedness, were the same ones that made it legendary. In an era when many believed that beauty equaled performance, the P-47 was a blunt reminder that war favors strength over elegance. The German pilots had laughed because they saw only what was on the surface: a machine that defied the conventional image of a fighter. They never expected that beneath its rough exterior lay one of the most effective killing machines ever built for the sky. Every era has its underdog, its unsung hero that people doubt at first glance. The Thunderbolt embodied that spirit in metal and fire. It stood as proof that true power doesn't always wear a graceful shape, that function and force often outlast style. The Luftwaffe's early laughter was born from arrogance, and arrogance has always been a dangerous weakness. By the time the smoke cleared over Europe, the laughter was gone, replaced by respect and perhaps a touch of fear for the American fighter that refused to fit their expectations. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew thousands of missions, destroyed thousands of enemy vehicles, and protected countless bomber crews. It outlasted its doubters and outperformed its critics. For every German pilot who once chuckled at the sight of that flying milk jug, there came a day when the sky filled with the roar of its engine and the fairy rain of its 8.50 caliber guns. Then the joke was over. The laughter stopped. The jug had the last word. When the engineers at Republic Aviation installed the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine into the frame of the P-47, they knew they were creating something extraordinary. It was not just another fighter engine, it was a masterpiece of American engineering, a 2,000 horsepower giant that embodied brute strength, reliability, and endurance. While other nations were pushing for lighter airframes and sharper agility, the Americans bet on power. They believed that if you could give a pilot enough horsepower, enough speed, and enough survivability, he could take on anything the enemy sent up against him and live to fight another day. The P-47 was the result of that philosophy. The R2800 was a double-row 18-cylinder radial engine that could turn fuel and air into sheer fury. When it fired up, the air around it trembled with the low, thunderous growl of contained chaos. Mechanics on the ground felt the vibration through their boots. Pilots sitting in the cockpit could sense it in their bones. A pulsing heartbeat of steel that promised both immense power and unforgiving responsibility. It was not a gentle engine. It demanded respect, precision, and strength to handle. But for those who mastered it, it offered something priceless: unmatched control of the sky. That engine could haul the P-47 to speeds of over 430 miles per hour at altitude, faster than most of its German adversaries. And it could climb with surprising determination for such a heavy machine. When a Thunderbolt pilot pulled back on the stick and opened the throttle, the double Wasp responded with a deep, growling surge, propelling the enormous aircraft upward as if gravity had loosened its grip. German pilots, accustomed to seeing sluggish, heavy fighters, were stunned when the P-47 kept pace or even outclimbed them in certain situations. The very power they had dismissed as irrelevant became the Thunderbolt's greatest weapon. It wasn't just about speed, it was about what that speed allowed the pilot to do. The P-47 could dive like a falling star. In combat, this was life or death. A pilot in trouble could roll over, point the nose toward the earth, and plunge away from an enemy. The heavy weight that others saw as a weakness now worked in his favor. Gravity and horsepower combined, and the Jug became unstoppable. German fighters that tried to follow in a dive often broke apart or lost control. Many Luftwaffe pilots learned the hard way that chasing a Thunderbolt down was a fatal mistake. In those moments, the P-47's enormous engine wasn't just an instrument of flight, it was a shield, a way to survive. But the true genius of the R-2800 wasn't merely its power, it was its reliability. War doesn't happen in laboratories or controlled environments. It happens in mud, rain, snow, and fire. Pilots needed engines that would start in freezing dawns, run smoothly at 30,000 feet, and keep going even after taking hits. The Double Wasp did all that and more. It could take damage that would cripple other engines, lose cylinders, leak oil, even catch fire, and still deliver enough thrust to bring its pilot home. Stories circulated of Thunderbolts limping back to base with holes the size of fists in their engines, smoke trailing behind them, yet still ticking away like a stubborn heartbeat refusing to stop. That reliability gave pilots something rare in war: confidence. To climb into a P-47 was to climb into a fortress with wings. They trusted that massive radial engine to carry them across the channel, into the heart of enemy territory, through flak and gunfire, and back again. It was more than machinery, it was a companion, a lifeline. Pilots spoke of it with the same affection they gave to their fellow airmen. They called it the toughest damn engine ever built, and they meant it. The R-2800's design was a triumph of practicality. Radial engines were often overlooked in favor of sleeker inline models like those found in German and British aircraft. Inline engines were aerodynamic, compact, and stylish, but they were also more fragile. A single bullet to the coolant system could bring them down. The P-47's radial engine, on the other hand, needed no liquid cooling. It relied on air, and that meant it could take hits and keep running. No coolant lines to rupture, no radiators to leak, just raw mechanical strength and the cooling rush of the wind. In combat, that difference saved lives. The engine's immense power also allowed the Thunderbolt to carry heavy loads without losing effectiveness. It could strap on bombs, rockets, and external fuel tanks, transforming from a high-altitude escort into a low-level ground attack beast. Even burdened with extra weight, the Double Wasp delivered. The Thunderbolt could still outrun danger, still climb out of flak-filled valleys, still haul itself home with half a wing missing. Power gave it versatility, and versatility gave it immortality in the annals of aviation. There was something almost poetic about how that engine sounded in flight. Other aircraft had sharp, whistling notes, but the P-47 thundered, a deep, rumbling growl that echoed across the countryside as it roared past. Allied soldiers on the ground recognized that sound instantly. They called it music, the music of salvation. They knew that when they heard that thunder, help was on the way. The Germans heard it too, but to them, it was a different kind of music, the prelude to destruction. That sound meant the sky itself was about to open up, raining lead, fire, and fury. For the men who designed it, the R-2800 was a symbol of what American industry could accomplish under pressure. Each engine was a masterpiece of precision engineering, thousands of parts working together in violent harmony. Factories across the United States worked around the clock, turning out engines that would soon roar across the world, from the Pacific Islands to the fields of Normandy. It was more than metal and fuel. It was a testament to determination, creativity, and the sheer will to outproduce and outfight tyranny. When you look at wartime photos of the P-47, its wide frame gleaming under the sun, its propeller slicing the air, you're looking at the power of that engine made visible. It's not the shape of the plane that tells its story, it's the raw energy coursing through its core. That 2,000 horsepower heart turned ridicule into fear, and fear into dominance. It allowed the Thunderbolt to escort bombers deep into enemy skies, to rip through armored convoys, to survive missions that no one thought possible. The laughter that greeted its first flights faded into silence, replaced by the distant rumble of an unstoppable force in motion. Every pilot who sat behind that engine carried a piece of its power with him. They felt it in their hands as the throttle pushed forward, in their chest as the vibrations rose, in their stomach as the horizon tilted and the sky fell away beneath them. The P-47 was not an easy machine to love at first glance, but once you flew it, once you felt that surge of horsepower under your command, you never forgot it. The engine made the pilot fearless, and in the unforgiving world of aerial warfare, fearlessness was everything. So when people ask what made the Thunderbolt great, what turned that ungainly, mocked machine into a legend? The answer begins with that engine. It was the soul of the aircraft, the sound of defiance in metal form. It gave the P-47 the ability to stand alone against faster, sleeker enemies and win. It was power that could not be ignored, a roaring reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in grace or beauty, but in the relentless force of sheer, unstoppable might. When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was first unveiled, it seemed to break every rule of what a fighter plane should be. It wasn't sleek like the British Spitfire or elegant like the German Messerschmitt. It didn't slice through the air with the grace of an artist's brushstroke. Instead, it was thick, rugged, and almost brutish. To many, it looked like the opposite of a fighter. Yet what the P-47 lacked in finesse, it made up for in something far more valuable on the battlefield: durability. It was an aircraft that didn't just fight, it survived. In war, beauty means nothing if you don't come home. That truth defined the Thunderbolt. The engineers at Republic Aviation designed it with a singular purpose: to keep its pilot alive while delivering devastating firepower to the enemy. Every inch of the aircraft was built around that philosophy. Its airframe was robust, almost over-engineered by traditional standards. The skin of the fuselage was thicker than most fighters of its time. The internal structure was reinforced to absorb shock and damage. Even the cockpit was designed like a cocoon of armor, a steel tub that shielded the pilot from bullets, shrapnel, and explosions. Many pilots would later say that sitting in a P-47 felt like sitting inside a tank with wings. They weren't exaggerating. The plane's heavy armor and sheer mass made it one of the most resilient machines in the sky. German pilots who scored hits on a Thunderbolt often found that it didn't matter. The American plane simply refused to die. Where a Messerschmitt might disintegrate from a single burst of return fire, the P-47 would take hit after hit, shrugging off damage like rain on steel. There are countless stories of Thunderbolts limping home from missions that should have ended in fairy disaster. One pilot returned with half his tail shot away, another landed with oil streaming from his damaged engine and holes riddling both wings. There were cases where a P-47 came back with cylinders blown, the canopy shattered, control cables severed, and yet somehow that massive machine still found its way back to base. Mechanics would look in disbelief at aircraft that seemed more patchwork than plain, their fuselages torn open by flak and gunfire, and yet the engines still idling as if nothing had happened. The Thunderbolt didn't just survive, it refused to quit. That toughness came at a cost. It was heavy, almost twice the weight of many fighters it faced. But that weight was deliberate. It meant thicker armor, stronger wings, and a sturdier frame. In combat, that translated into security. Pilots learned to trust their aircraft completely. They could dive through anti-aircraft fire or make low-level strafing runs against German convoys knowing that the Jug, as they affectionately called it, could take punishment and bring them back alive. The confidence that inspired was priceless. In war, courage often depends on trust. Trust in your comrades, trust in your training, and trust in your machine. The Thunderbolt earned that trust every day. It also carried firepower that was nothing short of staggering. The P-47 mounted 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. Each one could spit out bullets as thick as a man's thumb at a rate of nearly 800 rounds per minute. Together, they unleashed a storm of metal that no enemy aircraft could withstand. When a Thunderbolt pilot opened fire, the sky itself seemed to erupt. German planes caught in that barrage were torn apart almost instantly. It wasn't a matter of precision, it was a matter of overwhelming force. One well-placed burst could saw a fighter in half, shred the tail off a bomber, or rip through tanks and trucks on the ground. The combination of firepower and durability made the P-47 one of the most feared aircraft of the war. It could deliver destruction and survive the retaliation. Pilots used it not just as a fighter, but as a flying battering ram. When escorting bombers, they could dive into enemy formations, take hits, and keep fighting. When attacking ground targets, they could fly through thick flak that would have shredded other planes. It became the perfect weapon for both air superiority and ground attack, something few aircraft could claim. But the P-47's resilience wasn't just mechanical. It reflected a mindset, the American belief that winning a war meant endurance as much as brilliance. The Thunderbolt didn't rely on fancy maneuvers or fragile perfection. It relied on persistence, strength, and the ability to take a beating and come back swinging. In that sense, it mirrored the very spirit of the men who flew it. These were young pilots, many barely out of school, facing seasoned Luftwaffe veterans. They didn't have years of combat experience, but they had something else: machines that could keep them alive long enough to learn, to adapt, and to win. It's easy to underestimate the psychological effect of durability. When a pilot knows his plane can take hits, he fights differently. He fights harder. He takes risks others might avoid. German pilots quickly noticed that the Americans flying Thunderbolts seemed almost reckless, diving into impossible fights and coming out alive. What they didn't realize was that behind that aggression lay confidence in the machine. The P-47 could withstand damage that would kill other fighters, and that fact alone changed the dynamics of air combat. This toughness also gave the Thunderbolt a new purpose as the war evolved. When newer, longer-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang began taking over escort duties, the P-47 found a new calling as a fighter bomber. With its immense payload capacity and rugged construction, it became a terror to ground forces. It could carry bombs, rockets, and extra fuel tanks without compromising performance. It would scream down from the sky, guns blazing, bombs dropping and rockets streaking toward their targets. German soldiers learned to dread the distant roar of that engine. It meant destruction was coming, and there was little they could do to stop it. Even when riddled with anti-aircraft fire, the P-47 often made it home. Its armor protected vital systems, its radial engine could run on sheer willpower, and its control surfaces were built to endure damage. Ground crews sometimes marveled that their returning Thunderbolts had holes big enough to stick a head through, yet the pilots were alive, grinning, and ready to go again. The aircraft seemed to carry an invisible aura of invincibility. Durability in the end was not just a feature, it was the essence of the P-47's identity. It gave the pilots who flew it a sense of security unmatched by any other fighter of the era. It allowed them to press forward into danger, to take on missions that would have been suicide in lighter, more fragile aircraft. And it helped ensure that when those young men took to the skies over Europe, more of them came back. The Thunderbolt became not only a weapon of war but a symbol of survival. There was something profoundly human about its design philosophy. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't pretty, but it was strong. It could take punishment, adapt, endure, and keep going. That made it more than a machine. It made it a companion, a partner in the brutal dance of war. The men who flew it loved it for that reason. They knew that if everything went wrong, if the mission turned into chaos, if the sky filled with enemy fire, their jug would still be there, still flying, still fighting. And in that faith they found courage. When a P-47 Thunderbolt fired its guns, the entire world seemed to tremble. The roar of the Pratt & Whitney engine merged with the deafening crackle of 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, and the sky erupted in a storm of fire. In those moments, the plane wasn't just flying, it was breathing destruction. Few sights in the war struck such fear into German pilots and soldiers as the Thunderbolt in full attack, its wings flashing and tracers streaking through the air like molten rain. It wasn't elegant or precise, it was overwhelming. The P-47 didn't nibble at the enemy, it devoured them. Each of those Browning M2 machine guns was capable of firing around 800 rounds per minute, and with 8 mounted on the wings, the Thunderbolt could pour out a staggering amount of lead. In a single burst lasting just a few seconds, it could hurl nearly 100 bullets through the air. Each 50 caliber round was longer than a man's hand, heavy enough to tear through steel armor and ignite fuel tanks. One burst could slice through a fighter aircraft, shatter a truck convoy, or leave a train in ruins. Allied pilots used to joke that if you aimed in the general direction of the enemy, the sheer volume of fire would guarantee a hit. But there was truth in that humor. The Thunderbolt didn't need to be delicate. Its power lay in brute force. When German pilots first encountered the P-47's guns, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. They were used to facing British Spitfires and American P-40s armed with fewer lighter weapons. But the P-47's gunfire was something entirely different, a thunderous curtain of bullets that filled the sky. German veterans described it as flying into a solid wall of fire. If a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf found itself in front of a Thunderbolt's guns, it rarely escaped intact. The combination of speed, firepower, and durability turned the P-47 into a predator that could obliterate its prey in a single pass. The power of those guns extended far beyond air-to-air combat. As the war evolved, the Thunderbolt took on a new role: ground attack. The same firepower that shredded enemy aircraft proved devastating against anything that moved on the ground. P-47s began sweeping over railways, roads, and supply lines, turning their machine guns on trains, tanks, and convoys. German soldiers nicknamed it the Jebo, short for Jag Bomber or fighter bomber, and it quickly earned a reputation for terror. They would dive in from the clouds, guns blazing, and in seconds an entire armored column could be reduced to twisted wreckage. The 50 caliber rounds tore through trucks like paper and ripped open tanks with frightening efficiency. The shell's incendiary tips ignited fuel and ammunition, sending columns of smoke spiraling skyward. Pilots learned to aim for the softer spots: fuel trucks, locomotive boilers, and tank treads. One hit in the right place could halt an entire convoy. And even when their ammunition ran out, the mere sound of a Thunderbolt overhead could scatter troops into cover. Its guns had become psychological weapons as much as physical ones. The Brownings themselves were legendary weapons, simple, rugged, and nearly impossible to jam. They were air-cooled and electrically fired, mounted in perfect symmetry along the Thunderbolt's broad wings. That configuration gave the P-47 extraordinary stability when firing. Even as the guns unleashed torrents of bullets, the aircraft barely shook. Pilots could maintain their aim and deliver accurate bursts even in steep dives. The tracers streaking from both wings formed two fiery lines that converged into a deadly point ahead of the plane. When that convergence met an enemy target, the results were catastrophic. The visual effect of the Thunderbolt's firepower was unforgettable. On the ground, soldiers described it as watching a storm of light rip across the sky. Each burst looked like a string of red comets racing toward their target, followed by explosions and flashes. The sound was equally terrifying, a rolling, thunderous crack that echoed for miles. To German troops and pilots alike, that sound meant death was near. Even the most disciplined units broke formation under a P-47 strafing run. One of the greatest advantages of having such overwhelming firepower was the freedom it gave the pilot. In air combat, Seconds mattered. A pilot didn't always have time for a long, careful shot. With 8 guns, he didn't need to. A short burst from a Thunderbolt was enough to destroy most targets. Many Luftwaffe pilots who tried to dogfight Thunderbolts learned this the hard way. A single moment in a P-47's sights was often their last. And because the plane was so heavily armed, it didn't have to rely solely on agility or maneuvering. It could win by sheer force. As the war continued, the Thunderbolt's reputation grew. Pilots loved the confidence that came with knowing they had more firepower than almost anything else in the sky. When escorting bombers, they could tear into enemy interceptors with ease. When flying low, they could rake an entire battlefield with bullets, leaving devastation in their wake. The 50 caliber guns gave them dominance in any environment, from the frozen forests of the Ardennes to the skies over Normandy. The firepower also turned the P-47 into one of the most versatile aircraft of the war. It could carry bombs and rockets, but its guns alone were often enough to accomplish the mission. Pilots often preferred to conserve their heavier ordnance and rely on the Brownings instead. They were accurate, reliable, and devastatingly effective. A skilled pilot could destroy locomotives by firing at their boilers, or take out tanks by shooting through their thinner rear armor. The guns turned the Thunderbolt into a flying artillery piece, capable of shaping the battlefield from above. For the men on the ground, both friend and foe, the Thunderbolt's guns became a symbol. To Allied soldiers, they were a promise of protection. When pinned down by enemy fire, the distant roar of those machine guns meant salvation was near. Pilots flying close air support missions learned to strike just ahead of friendly troops, laying down streams of fire that cleared trenches and broke resistance. To the Germans, the same sound meant terror. Columns would scatter, anti-aircraft crews would abandon their guns, and trains would grind to a halt. The battlefield belonged to the Thunderbolt. There was something deeply visceral about those guns. Their sound, their fury, their sheer presence. They represented not just American engineering but American resolve. The decision to equip a single-engine fighter with 8 heavy machine guns was a statement. This was not a plane designed to dance or duel. It was designed to dominate. It could rip apart whatever stood in its way, and if it took damage, it would keep firing until the mission was done. Many pilots described the feeling of firing the P-47's guns as unforgettable. The aircraft would surge forward slightly under the recoil, the wings vibrating as streams of tracers poured ahead. Through the canopy, they could see their bullets march toward the target, see sparks and flames erupt as rounds struck home. It was a moment of pure, concentrated power, a sense of mastery over the sky. And beneath it all was the steady growl of the engine, the heartbeat of the Thunderbolt driving the storm forward. By the end of the war, the P-47's guns had destroyed tens of thousands of enemy vehicles, locomotives, and aircraft. They had paved the way for Allied advances, cleared skies for bombers, and crippled supply lines across occupied Europe. The Germans had begun by laughing at the Jug's bulky frame, but when its guns opened fire, the laughter vanished. The 8 Brownings turned the Thunderbolt from a curiosity into a legend, from a target of mockery into an instrument of fear. They gave it a voice that spoke in thunder and fire, and in the unmistakable language of victory. At the beginning of the air war over Europe, the P-47 Thunderbolt was met with sneers. To the Luftwaffe pilots who prided themselves on their sleek, lethal machines, this new American fighter looked like a flying joke, a bloated, heavy brute that seemed to defy the very principles of aerial combat. German pilots, men who had carved their reputations in the skies of Poland, France, and Britain, dismissed it as a lumbering target. They nicknamed it the Milchkrug, the milk jug, and assumed it would fall easily before the precision of their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. But arrogance is a dangerous companion in war, and before long that laughter turned into something else entirely. The first encounters between Thunderbolts and the Luftwaffe began in early 1943, when the American 8th Air Force was still finding its footing in Europe. The German pilots had grown used to the pattern of Allied raids, slow bombers escorted by underpowered fighters that could never follow them deep into occupied territory. When the P-47s appeared, the Germans didn't expect much. They dived in as they always had, confident their superior turn rate and combat experience would give them the advantage. But the first surprise came when the Thunderbolt pilots opened up with their 8.50 caliber machine guns. The sheer volume of fire was like nothing the Luftwaffe had faced before. In seconds, entire formations could be torn apart. Then came the second surprise. When German rounds found their mark, when cannon shells tore into the Jug's thick fuselage, the Americans didn't fall. They kept flying, they kept fighting. Pilots watched in disbelief as Thunderbolts they had riddled with bullets pulled up into steep climbs or dove straight into attack runs. What should have been kills became near misses, and what should have been easy victories turned into desperate escapes. Slowly word began to spread across Luftwaffe squadrons this new American fighter was not like the others. Reports started to trickle in, accounts of P-47 surviving impossible damage, of bombers that returned home safely because the Thunderbolts guarding them refused to die. German pilots who had once mocked the plane began to take it seriously. They learned to avoid certain maneuvers, to think twice before following one into a dive, for in a dive the P-47 was unmatched. Its massive frame and powerful engine turned gravity into a weapon. Once the Thunderbolt pointed downward, nothing could catch it. Even the famous Focke Wolf 1E90, the pride of the Luftwaffe, struggled to keep pace. Many German pilots who tried to follow simply ripped their wings apart from the strain. Those who survived called it the jug dive, and they warned others to stay away. By the summer of 1943, the laughter had stopped. The Luftwaffe's tone shifted from mockery to respect, and from respect to outright fear. The Thunderbolt had proven itself in combat not just as a fighter but as a survivor. Its pilots, once the newcomers of the sky, were growing confident. They learned to use the jug's strengths, its power, its dive speed, its firepower, and to avoid its weaknesses. In their hands, it became a hunter. Dogfights that began with German pilots in pursuit often ended with them fighting for their lives. German intelligence began to take note. Reports to headquarters described the P-47 as a heavy fighter with extraordinary speed and toughness. It could climb high, strike fast, and endure punishment that no other Allied fighter could. Luftwaffe commanders began issuing new tactical instructions: do not engage Thunderbolts unless necessary, avoid extended dives, and attack only from advantageous positions. In short, they were told to fear what they once laughed at. That transformation, mockery turned to caution, was a silent victory for the Americans. As more Thunderbolts filled the skies, the shift in morale became undeniable. German pilots who once owned the air now found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and outflown. The P-47s flew in disciplined formations, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory and tearing apart any interceptors that dared to approach. When the Luftwaffe tried to attack, they ran headlong into the Thunderbolt's wall of lead. The result was devastating. American air power, anchored by the durability and firepower of the P-47, began to erode the Luftwaffe's confidence. Fear is a powerful weapon, and the Thunderbolt wielded it with quiet efficiency. Luftwaffe veterans began to speak of the P-47 in the same hushed tones once reserved for the Spitfire or the Mustang. They respected its sheer power, its refusal to die, its relentless aggression. They had seen too many comrades vanish in flashes of gunfire, too many Thunderbolts plunge earthward only to pull up and return for another attack. Some German pilots even admitted that they would rather face 2 Mustangs than 1 Thunderbolt. The Mustang might chase you, they said, but the jug would destroy you. On the ground, the fear was even greater. By 1944, the Thunderbolt had evolved from a high-altitude escort to a low-level terror. Its pilots now prowled the countryside, hunting trains, convoys, and tanks. German soldiers learned to recognize the low, growling roar of its engine, a sound that sent entire battalions scrambling for cover. They had seen what those 8 machine guns could do to a line of vehicles, how rockets and bombs followed in their wake, how even heavily armored targets melted under the rain of 50-caliber fire. To the men below, the P-47 became the angel of death, a symbol of destruction that struck without warning and left nothing standing. The irony was that the very qualities that had made the Thunderbolt a target of ridicule were the ones that earned it respect. Its bulk, once mocked, gave it stability in a dive. Its weight, once seen as a disadvantage, allowed it to absorb incredible damage. Its large frame provided space for fuel, weapons, and the armor that saved countless lives. The Germans had mistaken brawn for clumsiness, and they paid the price. The P-47 didn't need to outturn its enemies, it just needed to outlast them. And it did, time and time again. As the Luftwaffe's numbers dwindled, their seasoned aces gone and their new pilots rushed into battle with minimal training, the psychological advantage of the P-47 became complete. The once feared German hunters were now the hunted. Thunderbolt squadrons roamed the skies with confidence, seeking out the last remnants of resistance. The Germans still flew with courage, but courage was no longer enough. Their aircraft were lighter, their resources thinner, and their spirits worn. Against the relentless power of the Thunderbolt, every encounter became a struggle for survival. There was a shift not only in tactics but in tone. Captured German pilots began speaking of the P-47 with reluctant admiration. They described it as a monster in the sky, a machine that seemed impervious to defeat. Some said that when they saw a formation of Thunderbolts ahead, they knew the battle was lost before it began. The respect that had been born out of mockery had transformed into awe, a bitter kind of acknowledgement that the enemy had built something extraordinary. For the American pilots, that shift in perception was deeply satisfying. Many of them remembered the early days when German aces ruled the skies and Allied losses were heavy. Now the tables had turned. The once invincible Luftwaffe was on the defensive, its pride wounded, its power fading. And at the heart of that transformation stood the P-47 Thunderbolt, the plane no one took seriously until it forced the world to take notice. The laughter that had once echoed across Luftwaffe airfields was gone, replaced by the grim reality of defeat. The German pilots who had mocked the Thunderbolt now looked for it in the sky with dread, knowing that if they saw its broad wings and snarling nose diving toward them, there might not be a way out. Respect in war is never freely given. It is earned in fire and blood, and the P-47 earned it in every battle, every mission, every roar of its guns over the torn skies of Europe. In the brutal air war over Europe, survival depended on the men and machines that could endure the longest. The Allied bombing campaign had a clear and simple objective: cripple Germany's industrial heart, choke its supply lines, and bring its war machine to a standstill. But achieving that goal required flying deep into enemy territory, through flak-freezing skies and relentless waves of Luftwaffe fighters. The bombers that carried this mission, massive B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, could deliver destruction, but they couldn't protect themselves forever. They needed guardians, fighters that could stay with them all the way to the target and back. And in the early, desperate years of the campaign, that guardian became the P-47 Thunderbolt. Before the Thunderbolt entered the stage, bomber crews paid a terrible price. The Luftwaffe's fighters would wait at the edge of Allied escort range, knowing the American fighters couldn't follow their bombers far into Germany. Once the escorts turned back, the German pilots would pounce. The sky would erupt in chaos, bombers burning, men bailing out, formations breaking apart. Losses were staggering. It wasn't uncommon for a mission to end with only half the bombers returning home. The message was clear: unless the Allies found a way to escort their bombers all the way to the target, daylight bombing might fail entirely. That was when the Thunderbolt began to prove its worth. When it first appeared, the P-47's size and weight drew skepticism, even among Allied pilots. It was huge for a single-engine fighter, bulky, heavy, and seemingly unsuited for the elegant dance of air combat. But what it lacked in grace, it more than made up for in endurance. Beneath its rugged skin lay the heart of a workhorse, the mighty Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, one of the most powerful piston engines ever built. It gave the Jug speed, altitude, and most importantly, the ability to absorb punishment that would have destroyed lesser planes. The Thunderbolt's endurance wasn't just physical, it was operational. With the addition of drop tanks, it could extend its range deep into Germany, escorting bombers further than any previous American fighter. For the first time, the US Army Air Forces could plan raids that didn't rely on the fragile hope of turning back before the Luftwaffe struck. The Thunderbolt would be there, flying in tight formation with the bomber streams, scanning the horizon for the black crosses of German fighters. Those early long-range escort missions were grueling. Thunderbolt pilots flew for hours in freezing conditions, navigating by dead reckoning and radio calls, often at altitudes where the air was so thin that oxygen masks were mandatory. They had to maintain formation with the slower bombers, throttling back their powerful engines and enduring turbulence from the bombers' prop wash. But they did it willingly, because they knew what was at stake. Every mission was a test of endurance, both for man and machine. And when the Luftwaffe came, the P-47s proved why they were built the way they were. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 would attack from above and behind, diving on the bomber formations in fast, deadly passes. The Thunderbolts would break off from escort, diving into the fray with all the fury their heavy engines could muster. Their massive weight became an asset. They could dive faster than any German fighter, reaching speeds that their enemies couldn't safely match. And once they caught up, the 8.50 caliber guns spoke with thunder. For the bombers watching from above, it was a breathtaking sight. They would see the streaks of tracers cutting through the sky, hear the crack of gunfire over the radio, and watch as German planes turned into fireballs or broke apart under the onslaught. The Thunderbolts were not just escorts, they were avengers. They flew like armored knights, protecting their comrades, cutting down any enemy that dared to approach. Their durability gave them a unique advantage in this deadly arena. Luftwaffe pilots, trained to hit and run, found that the Jug could take punishment that would cripple their own aircraft. It could come back from missions with holes in its wings, missing panels, even 1 or 2 cylinders blown out, and still land safely. Stories circulated among bomber crews of Thunderbolts limping home, with half their tail missing or engines coughing flames, only to touch down on Allied runways. To the men flying the bombers, that resilience meant trust. When they saw P-47s on their wings, they felt safer. They knew that even if the sky turned red with fire, those fighters would still be there. But it wasn't just protection from enemy aircraft that made the Thunderbolt invaluable. Its sheer toughness also made it an ideal escort through the deadly flak zones over Europe. Anti-aircraft guns blanketed the skies with exploding shells, and while nimble fighters could dodge some of it, there was no escaping it entirely. The P-47's thick armor and air-cooled radial engine could take shrapnel hits and keep flying. That air-cooled engine, unlike the liquid-cooled engines of many fighters, was a blessing. No radiator meant fewer critical weak points. A single bullet that might down a Mustang or a Spitfire would barely slow the Jug. As the war intensified, the Thunderbolt's range increased further. New external fuel tanks allowed it to fly deeper into the Reich than ever before. Escort routes expanded from coastal France all the way to Berlin and back, a feat once thought impossible. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, now found itself facing Allied fighters even in its own backyard. There was no safety, no sanctuary. The American bombers, once easy prey beyond escort range, now flew under the protection of these indestructible guardians. The psychological effect was enormous. German pilots, once confident of finding unescorted bombers deep inside their territory, now found themselves intercepted by P-47s long before they could strike. The hunters had become the hunted, and the bombers, who once faced missions of near certain death, could now complete their runs with dramatically lower losses. It was no exaggeration to say that the Thunderbolt changed the balance of the air war. Every mission the P-47 flew as an escort contributed to the collapse of German air power. As the Luftwaffe tried to defend its factories, its fuel depots, and its rail networks, it lost irreplaceable pilots to the Thunderbolt's guns. Each loss weakened Germany's ability to fight back, not just in the air but across the entire front. The Thunderbolt's protection allowed Allied bombers to systematically destroy all refineries, ball-bearing plants and aircraft assembly lines. The skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe were now ruled by the Jug and its partners. For the men inside the P-47s, those missions demanded courage and endurance. Escorting bombers wasn't glamorous, it was exhausting. Long hours of flight, constant vigilance, and the ever-present threat of attack tested every pilot's nerve. But they flew on day after day because they knew their role was vital. Their presence in the sky was the difference between victory and catastrophe. There are countless accounts of P-47 pilots who refused to abandon crippled bombers, even when low on fuel or ammunition. They would circle damaged planes, shielding them from enemy fighters, sometimes escorting them all the way back across the channel. In those moments, the Thunderbolt became more than a machine. It became a symbol of loyalty and brotherhood. Every bomber that made it home carried the unseen fingerprints of a P-47 pilot who had stood his ground in the storm. As the war neared its end, newer fighters like the P-51 Mustang extended the reach of bomber escorts even further. But by then, the Thunderbolt's legacy was secure. It had held the line during the most critical phase of the air campaign, when every mission hung in the balance. Without its strength, its firepower, and its endurance, the daylight bombing offensive might have collapsed before it truly began. The P-47 proved that sometimes, in the skies of war, victory doesn't belong to the fastest or the prettiest, it belongs to the toughest. By the middle of 1944, the war in Europe had entered a new phase. The Allies were advancing across France, closing in on Germany, and the need for air superiority had evolved into something even more critical: air dominance over the battlefield itself. The Luftwaffe was crumbling, but the German army was far from beaten. It fought fiercely, using its tanks, trains, and supply convoys to slow the Allied push. The sky above those battlefields became the realm of a new kind of warfare, one where the fighter wasn't just a hunter of other planes, but a scourge of everything that moved below. And no aircraft embodied that transformation better than the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The same traits that had made the Thunderbolt a superb escort fighter, its ruggedness, immense power, and heavy armament, made it perfectly suited for the brutal world of ground attack. What began as an air superiority fighter evolved into a flying tank, capable of diving into a hailstorm of flak and coming out alive. Pilots called it the Jug, and for German soldiers on the ground it became a name whispered in dread. Wherever the Jug appeared, destruction followed. The Thunderbolt could carry an astonishing payload. Beneath its broad wings, it bore bombs, rockets, and of course its 850 caliber Browning machine guns. Those guns alone could level a convoy, but when paired with 500 or 1,000-pound bombs and high-velocity rockets, the effect was apocalyptic. A single P-47 could deliver more firepower than an entire artillery battery, striking targets with terrifying precision. Allied commanders soon realized that the Jug wasn't just a fighter, it was a weapon of strategic annihilation. Its pilots adapted quickly to their new role. Gone were the high-altitude dogfights of escort missions. Now, the Thunderbolt screamed in low over the countryside, its engine howling like a beast as it tore through the air at tree-top level. Pilots learned to use terrain for cover, popping up only at the last moment to unleash their fury. The sky filled with the staccato chatter of machine guns, and the whoosh of rockets as they streaked toward trains, tanks, and columns of troops. German soldiers who heard that sound knew what came next: explosions, fire, and chaos. The Thunderbolt became the terror of the Wehrmacht's supply lines. It hunted the long, vulnerable trains that carried fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements to the front. A single P-47 could cripple an entire railway system by bombing bridges, blasting locomotives, and strafing freight cars. When its rockets struck, boilers exploded in clouds of steam and metal, rails twisted, and carriages were thrown into the air like toys. The Luftwaffe had once ruled the skies, now it was powerless to protect its own troops from the wrath of the Jug. Convoys were equally vulnerable. German trucks and tanks moving along roads in daylight risked immediate destruction. Thunderbolt squadrons roamed the skies like predators, waiting to spot the telltale glint of sunlight on metal. Once seen, the outcome was inevitable. The Jugs would dive, guns blazing, tracers slashing through the air. The first runs targeted the lead and tail vehicles, trapping the rest of the convoy. Then came rockets and bombs, tearing through the column until nothing moved. Survivors who tried to flee were met with more strafing fire. It was relentless, merciless, and devastatingly effective. Tanks too learned to fear the Thunderbolt. The German panzer divisions had once been the unstoppable spearheads of Blitzkrieg, but against the Jug's aerial fury, their armor offered little protection. But 50 caliber bullets couldn't always pierce a tank's frontal armor. The Thunderbolt pilots learned their craft well. They aimed for softer spots, the rear engine decks, trades, and fuel lines. A well-placed rocket or bomb could flip even the mighty Tiger tank, turning it into a flaming wreck. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers who once took comfort in the presence of tanks now dove for cover when they heard that deep, unmistakable roar overhead. The Thunderbolt's durability made all this possible. Flying low over battlefields was one of the most dangerous missions imaginable. Anti-aircraft guns, machine guns, and even small arms fire could fill the sky with lethal metal. Many aircraft couldn't survive a single pass through such fire. The P-47, however, was built like a fortress. Its thick skin and radial engine could take hits that would destroy any other fighter. Pilots often returned with holes punched through their wings, control surfaces shredded, or cylinders blown apart, and yet the engine kept running. Some even came back with landing gear shot away, forced to belly land their battered planes. Again and again they proved that the Jug was nearly indestructible. There was a saying among the Allied troops on the ground: if it's silver and it's overhead, it's ours. If it's dropping bombs, it's the Jug. The sight of those broad wings and gleaming fuselage inspired hope in every soldier pinned down by enemy fire. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a weapon, it was a guardian angel. When Allied troops faced counterattacks, the call for air support would bring the Jugs screaming in to obliterate the enemy. They could wipe out entire formations with a single strike, leaving only burning wrecks and silence behind. For the Germans, the psychological impact was devastating. They began to call the P-47 the Rop, or caterpillar, because it seemed to crawl endlessly across the sky, devouring everything in its path. Some even described the sound of its guns as the hammer of God. Soldiers learned to abandon vehicles and take cover at the first sign of one overhead. Roads that had once bustled with movement became ghostly quiet during daylight. The Thunderbolt had turned mobility itself into a liability for the German army. Its effect on the battlefield was so profound that it began to shape strategy. The Luftwaffe's collapse meant the Wehrmacht could no longer count on air cover, while Allied commanders increasingly relied on air power as their artillery in the sky. The P-47 became a cornerstone of air interdiction, the systematic destruction of enemy logistics, reinforcements, and infrastructure. Every bridge destroyed, every fuel truck incinerated, and every supply depot bombed by a Thunderbolt made the German war effort weaker. The Jug was not just winning dogfights, it was dismantling an empire piece by piece. Thunderbolt squadrons operated with a unique mixture of daring and precision. Their missions demanded courage bordering on recklessness. Flying at low altitude meant skimming treetops, dodging power lines, and braving constant fire from the ground. Pilots had mere seconds to identify targets, line up their attacks, and pull up before hitting the earth. Many described the sensation as both terrifying and exhilarating, a deadly bullet between man, machine, and gravity. But for all its danger, it worked. The P-47's presence alone changed the rhythm of battle. In Normandy, during the breakout from the beaches, the Thunderbolt's role was decisive. As German armor massed to counterattack, waves of Jugs descended from the clouds, unleashing rockets and machine gunfire that shredded entire divisions. The panzer columns that had once driven through Europe now found themselves annihilated from above. Similar stories played out across the Ardennes, in the Battle of the Bulge, and on the road to Berlin. Wherever the Jug went, it left smoldering wreckage and broken morale in its wake. Pilots of the P-47 took immense pride in their work. They were warriors of the skies, yes, but also craftsmen of destruction. They studied maps, learned enemy movement patterns, and adapted their tactics daily. Many developed an intimate familiarity with the terrain below, the roads, railways, and bridges they had bombed so often they could navigate by memory. For them, each mission was personal. They weren't just attacking targets, they were striking at the heart of the enemy's ability to fight. By 1945, the P-47 had earned a reputation as one of the most feared aircraft in the world. It had destroyed tens of thousands of vehicles, locomotives, and tanks. It had crippled Germany's ability to move, supply, and defend itself. What had started as a heavy, awkward-looking fighter had become the scourge of the battlefield. A machine whose very sound could send hardened soldiers running for cover. And through it all, the Thunderbolt remained true to its character: strong, unyielding, and utterly dependable. It was not graceful, but it was unstoppable. It didn't glide, it thundered. It didn't spar, it struck. And as it tore through the clouds above Europe, its shadow stretched over every German soldier who dared to look up. When the Second World War drew to its fiery close, the skies above Europe and the Pacific were littered with the remnants of the greatest air battles in history. The jet age was dawning, new technologies were rising, and the world was changing faster than anyone could grasp. Yet amid this transformation, one machine stood as a monument to a generation's courage and creativity: the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It had roared across the heavens like a storm, reshaped the art of aerial warfare, and proven that brute strength and human ingenuity could turn the tide of history. And long after the guns fell silent, its legacy would ripple through every aircraft that came after. The Thunderbolt had not been born from perfection but from necessity. In 1940, when Republic Aviation began designing it, the world was already on fire. The Allies were struggling, the Luftwaffe dominated the skies of Europe, and the United States was preparing for a war it had not yet entered. Engineers like Alexander Kartveli were tasked with an impossible challenge: build a fighter fast enough to catch the enemy, strong enough to survive battle, and powerful enough to protect the men who would carry freedom's banner into the sky. What they created was unlike anything the world had ever seen. A machine that defied convention, mocked elegance, and instead embodied sheer, uncompromising willpower. At first glance, the Thunderbolt seemed almost ugly, a brute of metal and rivets that looked too heavy to fly. But every curve, every bolt, every inch of its enormous fuselage served a purpose. Its massive radial engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, was a marvel of American engineering, 2,000 horsepower of raw force that could lift the plane to the stratosphere and hurl it through storms of flak. Its thick armor and rugged airframe were not symbols of excess but of foresight. The designers understood that in the crucible of combat, beauty meant nothing, survivability meant everything. It was this philosophy, function over form, strength over speed, that would shape the future of military aviation. The Thunderbolt proved that a plane didn't need to be the sleekest or lightest to be the most effective. It could be big, it could be heavy, it could be a beast, and still dominate the skies. The lessons learned from its design resonated far beyond World War II. The idea that endurance, power, and firepower could outweigh agility and minimalism became a guiding principle for generations of engineers. The P-47 was not just an aircraft, it was a blueprint for resilience. Its influence could be felt in the post-war era as aviation evolved from propellers to jets. When Republic Aviation went on to design the F-84 Thunderjet and later the F-105 Thunderchief, both carried the DNA of the P-47 in their veins. They were fast, heavily armed, and rugged, descendants of a machine that had proven the value of toughness under fire. Even in the modern age of stealth and supersonic flight, the lessons of the Thunderbolt remain embedded in the design ethos of American aircraft: redundancy in systems, survivability under damage, and adaptability in mission roles. The spirit of the P-47 extended beyond engineering. It represented a mindset. America's entry into World War II was not the tale of a nation already prepared for greatness, but of one that rose to meet the impossible. Factories that once built cars and tractors were transformed into assembly lines for Thunderbolts. Men and women worked side by side, 24 hours a day, riveting metal, testing engines, and pushing the boundaries of what could be built. Each P-47 that rolled off the line was a testament to the collective strength of a people united by purpose. It wasn't just a warplane, it was the embodiment of the American industrial spirit, forged in the fires of urgency and belief. Every time a P-47 pilot climbed into the cockpit, he carried with him that legacy. He knew that behind his machine stood thousands of workers who had poured their sweat into its creation, engineers who had refused to compromise, and a nation that had bet everything on his success. The aircraft became a symbol of that partnership between human determination and technological might. It was, in every sense, the flying manifestation of American resilience. Its reputation among pilots was legendary. They trusted it with their lives because it had earned that trust through performance. They knew it would bring them home, no matter how battered, no matter how far. Stories circulated of Thunderbolts limping back to base with wings shredded, engines smoking, fuselages riddled with holes, and still landing safely. That kind of reliability left a permanent mark on aviation doctrine. It proved that survivability wasn't just about luck or skill, it was a design philosophy. Future aircraft, from the A-10 Warthog to the F-15 Eagle, would echo that belief: build it tough, make it last, and let it fight another day. But the Thunderbolt's influence went deeper still. It changed the very psychology of air warfare. Before the P-47, many fighters were designed for one-role dogfighting. The Thunderbolt shattered that limitation. It was a multi-role aircraft before the term existed, excelling in air-to-air combat, escort duties, and ground attack. That flexibility redefined what a fighter could be. The concept of a single aircraft capable of performing multiple missions would become the foundation of future air forces around the world. From the F-4 Phantom to the modern F-35 Lightning II, the lineage of versatility can be traced back to the Jug. Its symbolic power also transcended its metal form. For soldiers on the ground, the sight of the Thunderbolt overhead was a promise. For the enemy, it was a warning. It represented not just American firepower, but American presence. The idea that when the United States committed to a fight, it would fight with everything it had. That symbolism persisted long after the war ended. Veterans spoke of the Jug not merely as a machine of destruction, but as a companion that embodied hope and survival. To them, it was a live creature of steel and thunder that watched over them from above. In museums and air shows today, when a restored P-47 starts its engine, the air still vibrates with that unmistakable growl. It's more than nostalgia, it's history made tangible. That deep, resonant sound carries the echo of a generation that refused to surrender, of a nation that turned adversity into advantage. Young engineers and aviators who see it for the first time are reminded that innovation isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. The Thunderbolt story teaches that even when the odds seem impossible, the will to create and endure can build something extraordinary. In its design, the Thunderbolt captured the soul of its era: bold, practical, and unyielding. It was not born from arrogance, but from a clear understanding of what was needed to win. Its engineers didn't chase dreams, they built solutions. That philosophy continues to shape military aviation, where the balance between power and protection, speed and survivability remains central. Every modern fighter that can take hits and keep flying owes a debt to the Jug. Every aircraft that carries a multi-mission loadout reflects its influence. Every design that values the pilot's life above aesthetic form carries its spirit forward. Even decades later, the P-47 remains a subject of study and admiration among aviation historians and engineers. Its combination of brute force and reliability stands as one of the purest expressions of wartime ingenuity. It showed that progress comes not only from visionaries, but from the courage to defy convention and the discipline to make that defiance work. The men and women who built and flew it left behind not just a machine, but a mindset. The conviction that with determination, even the impossible can be engineered into reality. There's a reason that the P-47 continues to hold a special place in the hearts of those who study the history of flight. It represents the moment when technology and tenacity fused into something greater than both. It was a machine that symbolized not just America's industrial might, but its character. The refusal to quit, the faith in human skill, and the belief that no obstacle was too great to overcome. Long after the last of them ceased flying combat missions, the Thunderbolt's silhouette endures as an icon. Its broad wings and thunderous engine speak of a time when courage was measured in altitude and miles, when victory depended on innovation, and when a single aircraft could change the course of a war. Its thunder may have faded, but its echo remains in the skies, in the machines it inspired, and in the spirit of resilience it left behind. The P-47 Thunderbolt earned many names during its wartime service, but none captured its essence more perfectly than the jug that couldn't be killed. It was a name that spoke not just to the aircraft's toughness, but to the spirit of the men who flew it. In an era when fragile, lightweight fighters could disintegrate from a single burst of gunfire, the P-47 defied the odds again and again, returning from missions with its wings shredded, engines punctured, and fuselages torn apart, and yet somehow still making it home. The Thunderbolt was more than just a machine of war. It was a survivor built to endure the unendurable. When pilots first climbed into the cockpit of the P-47, many were struck by its sheer size. Compared to the graceful Spitfires and nimble Mustangs, the Thunderbolt looked like a tank with wings. Its cockpit sat high above a vast, barrel-shaped fuselage, giving it a commanding view of the battlefield below. But that bulk was not a flaw, it was armor. The P-47's designers had built it with survivability as their first priority. Its airframe was reinforced with thick aluminum skin. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, and its radial engine could take punishment that would destroy any liquid-cooled engine in seconds. It was quite literally designed to take a beating and keep on fighting. In the skies over Europe, pilots quickly discovered that the P-47 was nearly indestructible. The radial engineer, a monstrous Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, was air-cooled rather than liquid-cooled, meaning it had no vulnerable radiator or coolant system. Enemy fighters could pepper it with bullets, even punch holes in the cylinders, and the engine would still keep turning. Pilots recounted returning to base with engines leaking oil and shaking violently, but still running strong enough to carry them home. That was the Thunderbolt's secret weapon. It didn't rely on perfection to fly. It could be damaged, limping, and bleeding smoke, and still survive. Stories of the jug's resilience spread through the Allied air forces like legend. One of the most famous came from Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, an ace pilot of the 56th Fighter Group. On one mission, Johnson's P-47 was ambushed by a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s. Cannon shells ripped into his aircraft, shredding control surfaces, puncturing the canopy, and leaving hundreds of holes across the fuselage. His cockpit filled with smoke and the controls jammed. Johnson was trapped, unable to bail out, convinced he was flying his own coffin. Then, in a moment of grim irony, a German ace, believed to be Egon Meyer, pulled alongside and emptied his guns into the crippled Thunderbolt, trying to finish it off. But the jug refused to die. It absorbed the storm of fire, staggered, and somehow kept flying. When Johnson finally coaxed the battered machine back across the English Channel, mechanics counted over 200 bullet and cannon holes in the airframe. The P-47 was practically disintegrating, but it had carried its pilot home. That kind of story wasn't rare, it was routine. Pilots of the 8th and 9th Air Forces would return from missions with tales of miraculous survivals that no other fighter could have managed. Some landed with flak holes large enough to crawl through. Others came back missing parts of the tail, riddled with shrapnel, or with wings so torn that daylight streamed through the metal. Yet the jug endured. Its rugged construction wasn't just luck. It was the result of careful engineering and a deep understanding of the realities of aerial warfare. Alexander Kartveli, the P-47's chief designer, once remarked, "If it doesn't come back, it can't fight another day." That simple truth shaped every decision in the aircraft's creation. Its survivability also gave pilots something more valuable than any weapon: confidence. A pilot who believed his aircraft could bring him home fought differently, more aggressively, more bravely. The men who flew the P-47 knew they could dive into danger, strafe enemy convoys, or duel with the Luftwaffe's best, and still have a fighting chance of returning alive. That confidence translated into effectiveness. The Thunderbolt's pilots pushed deeper into enemy territory, stayed longer over targets, and took on missions that might have been suicidal in other planes. Nowhere was this toughness more vital than in ground attack missions. Late in the war, the P-47 found its true calling as a fighter-bomber, striking German convoys, tanks, and railways with rockets and bombs. These low-level missions were incredibly dangerous. Flak batteries, small arms fire, and even concealed machine gun nests could turn the sky into a death trap. Yet the Thunderbolt thrived there. Pilots could take hits from anti-aircraft guns, feel the plane shake and groan under fire, and still make it back to base. The jug's thick armor protected not only its vital systems but the pilot himself. Many who flew it said they felt safer in the P-47 than in any other aircraft in the war. There was one story of a Thunderbolt pilot who returned from a strafing run with half his tail assembly gone, fuel pouring from ruptured tanks, and smoke billowing from the engine. The ground crew could hardly believe it was still airborne. As it taxied to a stop, The pilot climbed out, his hands shaking, and stared at the damage in disbelief. The P-47 looked as though it had flown through hell itself, and won. That image, repeated countless times across airfields in England, France and Italy, became part of the Thunderbolt's mythos. It wasn't just a machine. It was a protector, a guardian angel of steel. Even the Luftwaffe came to respect and fear the P-47's resilience. German pilots quickly learned that a short burst of cannon fire enough to down a Spitfire or a Mustang might not stop a Thunderbolt. They would attack, watch the jug take hit after hit, and still see it climbing, turning, and fighting back. Many Luftwaffe veterans later recalled the frustration of seeing their rounds ricochet off its armor, as if the American plane was carved from iron. One German ace reportedly told his comrades, "If you see a Thunderbolt, attack it only if you must, and then pray." The jug's toughness was matched only by its endurance. Its massive fuel capacity and turbo-supercharged engine allowed it to fly long-range escort missions deep into German airspace. On the return trips, many Thunderbolts limped home alone, their formations scattered, their tanks leaking, their engines sputtering, but still flying. The number of pilots saved by the P-47's durability is impossible to measure, but its contribution to the survival rate of Allied airmen was enormous. The legend of the jug that couldn't be killed wasn't just a nickname, it was a truth proven daily in combat. Pilots often joked that even if you shot the wings off, it would find a way to glide home. Mechanics on the ground grew accustomed to patching holes the size of dinner plates, replacing torn control surfaces, and sending the same battered aircraft back into battle days later. The P-47 didn't just survive, it refused to die. Its survivability shaped the way future aircraft were designed and how future wars were fought. Engineers studying the P-47 realized that in modern air combat, strength and redundancy could mean the difference between victory and loss. The idea of overbuilding, adding layers of protection, designing for damage tolerance, became a guiding philosophy for later generations of aircraft. Decades later, the A-10 Thunderbolt TOE, affectionately called the Warthog, would carry that legacy forward. Like its namesake, it was built to take hits, fly home, and protect those below. The name wasn't a coincidence, it was an homage. The original Thunderbolt had proven that indestructibility could be engineered. For the men who flew it, the P-47's toughness wasn't an abstract technical trait, it was personal. They trusted it with their lives and it repaid that trust tenfold. Many veterans spoke of their Thunderbolts as if they were living beings, friends, even comrades. They told stories of aircraft that brought them home against all odds, as if the jug itself had refused to give up on them. In those moments, the line between man and machine blurred. The pilot's courage and the aircraft's strength became one and the same. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt's unmatched survivability wasn't just about armor and design. It was about spirit. It symbolized the endurance of the men who built it, the bravery of those who flew it, and the determination of a nation that refused to be broken. It was proof that even in the darkest skies, resilience could prevail. And that is why, long after the last one flew in combat, the jug remains immortal, not just as a fighter, but as the plane that refused to die. When the last echoes of gunfire faded over Europe, and the skies finally cleared of contrails and smoke, one sound lingered in the memory of those who had fought the deep, thunderous growl of a P-47 Thunderbolt roaring home from battle. It was the voice of a machine that had been mocked, underestimated, and dismissed as ungainly, and yet had gone on to carve its name into history as one of the greatest fighters ever built. Its legacy would not end with the war. The lessons it taught about design, courage, and resilience would ripple through generations, transforming not just aviation, but the very idea of what it means to be strong. The story of the P-47's legacy begins with misunderstanding. When it first appeared in the early 1940s, it was met with skepticism and laughter. Pilots and engineers alike questioned how something so bulky and heavy could survive in the thin, merciless air of combat. German pilots nicknamed it the Flying Milk Jug, mocking its rotund silhouette. Even some American pilots doubted it at first, preferring the sleek lines of the P-51 Mustang or the compact agility of the Spitfire. The Thunderbolt seemed to defy every conventional principle of fighter design. But as the war progressed, the laughter faded, replaced by awe and respect. The P-47 wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense. It was beautiful in its purpose. It was a reminder that power doesn't always wear a graceful face, and that innovation often emerges from defiance rather than conformity. That defiance became the root of its legacy. The Thunderbolt shattered the myth that only speed and elegance could win wars. It proved that survivability, endurance, and adaptability could be just as decisive. Its rugged frame, thick armor, and monstrous radial engine turned it into a flying fortress of single-seat determination. The P-47 did not glide through combat. It charged through it, unbothered by flak and gunfire. Its pilots didn't dance in the sky, they fought like titans, thundering down from the clouds to unleash 8.50 caliber guns that ripped through enemy aircraft and ground targets alike. In those moments, strength became its own form of grace. The transformation from laughter to legend did not happen overnight. It was forged through thousands of missions, over burning cities and open fields, across frozen rivers and bomb-scarred railways. Every time a P-47 brought a pilot home on a wing and a prayer, its reputation grew. Every time it blasted through flak and returned to base with more holes than metal, it proved that design ingenuity and raw determination could overcome any flaw of form. The aircraft that once seemed clumsy became the symbol of reliability, the dependable guardian of bomber crews, the thunderous angel that could take a beating and still come roaring back for more. But the P-47's legacy extended far beyond its physical capabilities. It became a reflection of the people and nation that built it. America, too, had been underestimated at the start of the war, seen as inexperienced, untested, perhaps too industrial and unrefined to compete with Europe's long traditions of warfare and engineering. Yet, like the Thunderbolt, America found strength in its size, its resources, and its sheer willpower. The assembly lines that produced the P-47 became symbols of national unity. Thousands of men and women, mechanics, welders, riveters, and engineers, worked around the clock to create a machine that embodied their collective determination. Every jug that rolled out of the Republic Aviation plant carried a piece of that spirit into the sky. When pilots spoke of the P-47 after the war, their tone was not merely technical, it was reverent. They remembered it not just as a machine, but as a companion, a protector, a friend. It was an aircraft that gave them courage because it had courage of its own. They told stories of returning home with bullet holes in the wings, smoke trailing from the engine. The canopy cracked and instruments dead, and still the jug landed. They told of escorting bombers through storms of flak, fighting off enemy fighters, then dropping low to strike trains, tanks, and convoys before limping home on empty fuel tanks. These stories became legends, passed down through generations of aviators, reminding them that the measure of a great aircraft isn't in its looks or its specifications. It's in its will to endure. That enduring spirit found its way into future aircraft, shaping the philosophy of aviation design for decades to come. Engineers learned that survivability and redundancy could be as critical as speed and maneuverability. The Thunderbolt's lessons echoed through the design of post-war jets and attack aircraft. When the Republic Aviation Company later developed the A-10 Thunderbolt II, they deliberately chose the name to honor the original jug. The A-10 shared the same soul, heavily armored, brutally effective, and nearly indestructible. Like its namesake, it was mocked for its looks, called ugly, slow, and ungainly. But when it took to the battlefield, it earned the same grudging respect. The spirit of the P-47 lived on in the A-10's titanium armor and its unwavering mission to protect those on the ground. The Thunderbolt's influence wasn't just mechanical, it was moral. It became a symbol of perseverance, of strength under pressure, of the triumph of substance over style. In a world often enamored by appearances, the P-47 reminded everyone that true greatness lies in purpose. It didn't need to be the fastest or the most elegant, it needed to win. And it did, again and again. Its legacy became a lesson not only for engineers and pilots, but for anyone who dared to challenge convention. Sometimes the most effective solution is the one that others laugh at first. Sometimes the ungainly machine, the underestimated fighter, or the overlooked idea turns out to be the one that changes everything. Even decades after the war, the P-47's thunder continues to echo. Restored examples roar through the skies at air shows, their engines still thundering with the same defiant growl that once terrified the Luftwaffe. Veterans and historians gather to honor its achievements, and new generations watch in awe as the great machine takes flight again. When that radial engine roars to life, it's as if time folds back. The laughter of skeptics is drowned out by the sound of pure power, the voice of a survivor that refuses to fade into history. Its story has become more than just a chapter in aviation history. It is a parable of resilience. The P-47 reminds the world that innovation often begins with doubt, that progress often comes from persistence, and that strength often hides beneath what others dismiss as flaws. In the hands of skilled pilots, the Thunderbolt became a legend, but in the hearts of those who remember it, it became something even greater, a symbol of how determination and ingenuity can turn derision into dominance. In museums across the world, the P-47 stands silently now, wings stretched wide, polished to a mirror shine. Children gaze up at it, marveling at its size, its shape, its improbable form. They may not know the stories of the men who flew it, or the laughter that once greeted its first flight, but they can sense its power. There is something undeniably majestic about the jug's presence, a quiet authority that comes from knowing what it has endured. It doesn't need to prove itself anymore. The skies have already done that for it. The P-47 Thunderbolt was more than metal and mechanics. It was a statement. It said that strength matters, that resilience can win wars, and that true innovation isn't always pretty. Its 8.50 caliber guns didn't just destroy enemies, they silenced doubt. Its heavy armor didn't just save pilots, it reshaped the future of aircraft design. Its endurance didn't just win battles, it inspired generations to believe that power, persistence, and courage can transform ridicule into reverence. Today, when its story is told, the laughter that once followed it has long been replaced by admiration. The P-47 stands as proof that legends are not born from perfection. They are forged in struggle, in the fires of adversity, and in the will to keep flying when everything else says fall. It is a monument to the idea that true greatness endures not because it is beautiful, but because it is unstoppable.